In 1947, 39 intellectuals gathered at a Swiss hotel by Lake Geneva, near the town of Montpellier. They had been convened by Friedrich Hayek, an Austrian economist who believed the world was heading in a dangerous direction. Too much state. Too much planning. Too much faith in government intervention. Nobody paid them much attention. The world was building welfare states, nationalizing industries, and regulating markets. Hayek and his colleagues seemed like relics of a bygone era. 30 years later, their ideas governed the world. How did a group of marginal academics come to define global economic policy for decades? That is the story of neoliberalism. And it is a story that must be told carefully, because few words in economics generate as much confusion and as much anger. In the previous episode, we saw how the welfare state was built on the idea that markets need state correction. During the post-war decades, that idea dominated economic policy in the West. High taxes, heavy regulation, public enterprises, growing social spending. But in the 1970s, something went wrong. Inflation soared. Growth stalled. Unemployment rose. The phenomenon was called stagflation, and the dominant Keynesian models did not explain it well. In that vacuum, the ideas of the Montpellieran society found their moment. Neoliberalism was not born as an insult. It was born as a serious intellectual project with deep roots. The first root is the Austrian school. Hayek and Mises argued that central planning was impossible because no planner can process all the information that market prices transmit in a decentralized way. The market is not perfect, but it is the best coordination mechanism we have. The state, by intervening, distorts price signals and generates inefficiencies. The second root is the Chicago school. Milton Friedman, its central figure, added an empirical dimension. He demonstrated that the Great Depression was worsened not by market failures, but by errors at the Federal Reserve, which contracted the money supply when it should have expanded it. The lesson, according to Friedman, was not that markets were unstable, but that governments were worse. The third root is German ordoliberalism. This lesser-known approach, outside Germany, argued that the market needs a strong institutional framework, clear rules, genuine competition, a state that acts as referee but not as player. Ordoliberalism influenced the construction of Germany's post-war social market economy. What these currents shared was a deep distrust of state intervention in the economy. But they differed on important nuances. Hayek distrusted almost all intervention. Friedman accepted a minimal state with a basic safety net. The ordoliberals wanted a strong state that guaranteed competition. Calling all of this neoliberalism is a simplification, but it is the name that has stuck. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher won the elections in the United Kingdom. In 1981, Ronald Reagan reached the presidency of the United States. Both turned the ideas of Montpellieran into real policy. The program was clear. Cut taxes, especially on high incomes in corporations. Privatize public enterprises. Deregulate markets, especially financial ones. Weaken unions. Reduce social spending. Control inflation through monetary policy, not fiscal policy. The results were mixed, and that is the only honest way to describe them. Inflation was controlled. In the United States, Paul Volcker, chair of the Federal Reserve, raised interest rates to levels that caused a brutal recession but ended the inflationary spiral. In the United Kingdom, restrictive monetary policy had similar effects. Economic growth recovered in both countries, although the causes are debated. Defenders of the model attribute the recovery to the reforms. Critics point out that the recovery coincided with falling oil prices and other factors independent of economic policy. Inequality increased. In the United States, the income share of the top 1% went from capturing approximately 8% of national income in 1980 to over 20% by 2015. In the United Kingdom, the pattern was similar. Defenders argue that inequality is an acceptable price for growth. Critics respond that growth disproportionately benefited those who were already rich. Deindustrialization accelerated. Entire communities that depended on traditional industries, like mining in northern England or steel in the American Rust Belt, were devastated. New service and technology industries grew, but in other places and for other workers. If Thatcher and Reagan applied neoliberalism in their own countries, the Washington Consensus exported it to the developing world. In 1989, economist John Williamson coined the term to describe a package of 10 reforms that the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United States Treasury recommended, and often imposed as conditions for receiving loans, on developing countries. Fiscal discipline. Trade liberalization. Privatization. Deregulation. Openness to foreign investment. The results in Latin America, the main recipient region of these policies, are genuinely ambiguous. Inflation was controlled in countries that had suffered chronic hyperinflation. Economies opened up and modernized in many respects. Trade grew. But privatizations were often corrupt, benefiting local elites and foreign investors at the expense of public services. Trade liberalization destroyed local industries that could not compete. Structural adjustment programs cut social spending in countries where poverty was already extreme. Argentina is the most cited case. It followed the consensus prescriptions to the letter during the 1990s. And in 2001, the system collapsed in the worst economic crisis in its history. In East Asia, the story was different. The Asian tigers, which had grown with strong state intervention, faced the financial crisis of 1997. The IMF imposed austerity conditions that, according to many economists, worsened the crisis instead of resolving it. Joseph Stiglitz, then chief economist of the World Bank, harshly criticized the fund's prescriptions. It was a crack within the establishment itself. If the Washington Consensus was questioned by its results in the developing world, the financial crisis of 2008 questioned the model at its very heart. Financial deregulation, a cornerstone of the neoliberal program, had allowed banks to take risks that turned out to be catastrophic. Complex financial instruments that no one fully understood, subprime mortgages packaged and sold as safe assets, leverage levels that defied prudence, all of this was possible because regulation had been deliberately relaxed. When the system collapsed, governments rescued the banks with public money. The irony was not lost on anyone. For decades, the message had been that the state should step aside and let markets work. But when markets failed, it was the state that paid the bill. Defenders of free markets argue that the crisis was not the fault of deregulation, but of state intervention, including the implicit guarantees to banks too big to fail, which distorted incentives. It is an argument with partial merit, but difficult to sustain as a complete explanation. After 2008, neoliberalism as a political project lost much of its momentum. But as an institutional framework, many of its reforms remain in place. Financial markets have been partially re-regulated, but not back to the levels of the 1970s. Privatizations have not been reversed. Trade globalization has not been undone. For millions of people, neoliberalism is not an academic debate. It is a lived experience. For those who prospered in the new economy of services, technology, and finance, the neoliberal decades were ones of unprecedented opportunity. Global careers, mobility, access to cheap goods produced around the world. For those who depended on traditional industries, unstable jobs with a union and a pension, those same decades were ones of loss. Loss of employment, of status, of community, of certainty about the future. The disconnect between these two worlds explains much of contemporary politics. The rise of populism, on both the left and the right, has deep economic roots. When large segments of the population feel that the economic system does not work for them, they look for alternatives outside the established consensus. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, neoliberalism was born as a serious intellectual project in response to real problems, the stagflation of the 70s and the excesses of state planning. Its roots in Hayek, Friedman, and ordoliberalism represent traditions of economic thought with solid arguments about the limits of the state. Second, applied as policy, neoliberalism produced mixed results. It controlled inflation and stimulated growth in many places, but also increased inequality, devastated industrial communities, and in the developing world generated crises when applied as a universal recipe without attending to local context. Third, the crisis of 2008 was the model's toughest stress test. Financial deregulation contributed to the disaster, and the public rescue of banks weakened the credibility of the anti-state discourse. Today, neoliberalism as a label is discredited, but many of its institutional reforms remain. Neoliberalism wanted a smaller state. But some thinkers went much further. What if we did not need a state at all? Or hardly any? Next time we explore the far end of the spectrum, libertarians, anarchists, and state minimalists.